I would like to begin the class by observing that the present poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden, is a work which belongs to a great tradition which flourished for centuries, for even thousands of years in Western literature. And this is the tradition of one great poet lamenting the death of another great poet. We have lament for Bion by the Greek poet, by the ancient Greek poet Moschus, written probably around BC 150. We have lament for Chaucer, written by Thomas Harcliffe in the 15th century. We have Lycidas, in which John Milton mourns the death of Edward King, written perhaps in 1637, I think published in 1638. We have Adonais, in which P.B. Shelley mourns the death of John Keats, 1821, if I'm not wrong. And of course, we have In Memoriam, A.H.H., in which Alfred Tennyson mourns the death of his friend and budding poet Arthur Henry Hallam. I think the work was published in 1850. It is to this tradition that the present poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats by W.H. Auden, belongs. In Memory of W.B. Yeats is one of the most famous, most highly anthologized, most often read poem of W.H. Auden. Winston Hugh Auden is one of the three great poets, three great English language poets of the 20th century, at least the first part of the 20th century. The other two being, of course, W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot. The hardcore admirers of W.H. Auden see him as an equal to W.B. Yeats as well as to T.S. Eliot. There is no doubt that Auden made a remarkable contribution to literature. The poetry of Auden stands out for the magic of its words, the passion and the energy invested in it, the passion and energy invested in the lines of his poetry. Your willingness to handle themes from various areas of life, various areas of experience, including war, love, politics, poverty, injustice, revolution, art, for its exceptional sincerity. Because the poetry of Auden is a poetry which refuses to wear masks. The present poem is the expression of one poet commemorating the memory of another poet. One great poet remembering another great poet. Auden remembering Yeats. In memory of W.B. Yeats. The life, the work, the context of W.B. Yeats is recalled by Auden, one great poet calling up the memory of another great poet. It has to be pointed out that this poem is, of course, about Yeats, the life of Yeats, the death of Yeats, but also the death of Yeats gives the poet, gives Auden an opportunity to speak about very different things. This poem is not merely about Yeats, it's about so many other things, and that's why it's a very remarkable poem. Among the important thematic concerns of the poem are poetry itself, the relationship between poetry and society, contemporary politics, the contemporary international situation, the state of Ireland, from where Yeats came. Yeats was easily the greatest Irish poet ever. The poem has a carefully chosen title, In Memory of W.B. Yeats, which gives the reader a clear picture of what to expect. The title clarifies or makes it clear that this poem is about one great poet commemorating the memory of another great poet, Auden commemorating the memory of Yeats. The poet has provided the poem with a very powerful opening. We get dramatic pictures of Europe at the height of winter. The brooks are frozen, the airports are deserted. There is snow everywhere, and the snow manages to disfigure the public statues. The mercury sings in the evening. Obviously, the nighttime temperature is significantly below zero. You must remember that W.B. Yeats breathed his last in France on January the 28th, 1939. And January is usually the coldest month of the year in Europe. The point that the poet is trying to make is that there is a close linkage between the death of the poet, death of the great poet, and the climatic situation in Europe where the death takes place. It is the height of winter, and winter has always been associated in Western culture, in Western literature, with death. At the end of the stanza, the poet makes this point clear. After giving those stark pictures of Europe at the height of winter, the poet arrives at the conclusion, and it's a conclusion arrived at by not just the poet but by all the instruments, that it was, I quote, a dark, cold day, unquote. A dark, cold day. There is a dramatic shift as the trajectory of the poem, the thematic trajectory of the poem moves from the opening stanza to the second stanza. In the second stanza, the poet speaks of life being largely unaffected by the death of the great poet. He mentions the wolves running through the evergreen forests. The wolf is a symbol of freedom, of survival under hostile circumstances. Evergreen forests, forests whose leaves are always green. The trees never shed their leaves in an evergreen forest, unlike in a deciduous forest. Green symbolizes life, evergreen. The poet seems to suggest that life will go on. Life, which is symbolized by the green color of the evergreen forest, is largely unaffected by the death of the great poet. The river is frozen, and the poet puts it in a characteristic manner. The peasant river is untempted by the fashionable quays. The quay is a landing place. The quay is a platform built by the side of the bank of a water body, either parallel to the bank or at right angles to the bank. It's a landing place. The poet sees the river as a peasant. The quay is where the vessels come, the boats come, the ships come, where the landing takes place, where fashionable travelers get off the ship or get onto the ship. The river is a peasant and is quite happy being a peasant, is quite happy being a rustic character, and is not tempted by the fashionable quays. All that happens is that the river is frozen, and the water of the river refuses to move. The death of the poet is moaned, moaning tongues, but the death is kept from his poems. The death does not affect his poems. The poems of W.B. Yeats are what they are, whether the poet is alive or the poet is dead. Of course, the death of the poet is mourned. There are mourning tongues. But that does not mean that his work, his poetry, is affected by the death of its creator. I would like to point out that this is one of the stock themes of Auden. He was fascinated by the fact that what happens to a person, what happens to an individual, has no bearing on society as a whole, on the world as a whole. This is one of the, in fact, this is one of the major thematic concerns of Auden's well-known poem, Muse W.B.Yeats. I think you can also pronounce it as Muse W.B.Yeats, where the poet explains how the experience of an individual, the suffering of an individual, does not significantly affect the life of the world. The life of the world goes on and on and on, unaffected by what happens to an individual. Here, in the present poem, The death of such a great poet, arguably the greatest living English language poet of the time, is unable to affect significantly the life of the world which goes on as if the death had not taken place. We come to the third stanza, and Auden gives us a powerful, precise, unsentimental description of the last hours of the poet. The poet says that it was an afternoon of nurses and rumors. Life goes out of the body of W.B. Yeats. The body of W.B. Yeats becomes a dead body. This is presented in a very original manner. It is as if a city stops functioning. It is as if a country stops functioning. Perhaps Auden identifies Yeats with Dublin, the capital of Ireland, in whose suburb Yeats had a least accommodation, the city most identified with the greatest Irish poet of all time. The poet speaks of the provinces of his body, the provinces of his body, the squares of his mind, the silence invading his suburbs. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind became empty. Silence invaded his suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. See how graphically, how in a very original manner, the poet presents the death of Yeats. How the body, a few minutes back, a living body, has now become a dead body. The poet becomes his admirers. It may seem that there is a contradiction here, because earlier the poet had said, Auden had said, that his death is kept from his poems, that his death does not affect his poems. The contradiction is only superficial. On the one hand, the death of W.B. Yeats does not affect his poetry. On the other hand, the poet continues to live in the hearts of his admirers. And today, even today, the poet continues to live in his admirers. The poet is his admirers. I would like to pause for a moment and bring into conjunction with the poem under discussion, or rather with the stanza under discussion, W.B. Yeats's poem, Death. Yeats's poem titled Death is not a very well-known poem. It contrasts an animal's experience of death against a human being's experience of death. And when he wrote those lines, when he wrote the poem titled Death, Yeats perhaps had his own death in mind. I would like to quote a couple of lines from the poem Death. I quote from memory. This is what Yeats says about the human experience of death. A man awaits his end, dreading and hoping all. I repeat, A man awaits his end, dreading and hoping all. Early in the stanza, Auden speaks of the last afternoon in the life of W.B. Yeats as his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. I have a problem with it. His last afternoon as himself is perfectly understandable. He ceased to be himself once he died, the way he was himself. An afternoon of rumors is also understandable. Throughout Europe, especially in the literary world of Europe, rumors circulated that the great poet W.B. Yeats had breathed his last. But an afternoon of nurses appears to me to be problematic. W.B. Yeats passed away in the south of France. He went to the south of France every winter in the very last phase of his life because south of France is usually not extremely cold by European standards during winter. But the winter of 1938-1939 was exceptionally cold. And that was one of the reasons why, probably why, the life of Yeats came to an end. And Auden gives a graphic description of that particular winter in Europe at the very beginning of the poem. It was an exceptionally cold winter, and even in the south of France it was quite cold. W.B. Yeats breathed his last not in an hospital, but in a first floor room of an hotel. The hotel was located in, it is still located in Raghu, Cap Martin, a small town in the south of France. I'm not sure whether I pronounce the name correctly. I think it's Raghu, Cap Martin. I don't know how the French pronounce it. And I don't think there were medical nurses, medical sisters by his side when he died. My information is that there were two women by his side. One was his wife George. The other was his last mistress, Edith Shackleton Heald. Perhaps the poet, perhaps Auden, sees these two women as nurses because they were indeed nursing the great poet during the last days, the very last days of his life. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. The poet is here amplifying on his earlier statement. He became his admirers. The poet has no physical existence now. He exists only in the hearts and the minds, in the admirations of his admirers. The poet explains how this happens and also the limitations experienced by this process. In fact, this is one of the favorite thematic ideas of Auden. The limitations of poetry, the limitations of art, The poet is now scattered among 100 cities. Poetry does not have a mass readership, a mass following. And the poet's admirers sitting in 100 cities are reading him, that's all. And he is wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. How can we explain the term unfamiliar affections? Affections of persons who never personally knew the poet, or affections roused by the poetry of the poet, which are affections which are unfamiliar to the poet himself. The poet never expected to be loved, to be liked, to be admired in this particular manner, because you must understand that the response that a passage of poetry evokes in a reader need not be exactly the response that is expected by the poet, that is planned for by the poet. And this point is further clarified in the lines that follow. The poet has to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The poet is evaluated, the poet is assessed, the poet is criticized by his readers using parameters which the poet would not have seen even in his wildest dreams. The poet just writes poetry, nothing beyond that. The poetry written by the poet is evaluated, criticized, denounced, punished using critical parameters which have nothing to do with the poetry of the poet, which were unknown to the poet when he wrote the poetry, and which probably he never was aware of in his life. Thus, the poet is punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. This appears rather like a poetic rendering of the fundamental principle of the reader response theory, which would rise to prominence in the 1960s. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. It is the living, guts of course means stomach, belly. It is the living, the reader, who decide the final meaning of the text. There could have been a meaning intended by the writer, but that is modified by the reader. And the reader response theory seems to believe that it is the reader rather than the writer who writes the book. I wonder whether Auden is anticipating the reader response theory that would rise to prominence in the 1960s. Maybe he is even anticipating Roland Barthes' landmark essay, The Death of the Author. And The Death of the Author, you must remember, was first published in 1967. As the poem moves towards the end of its first part, the poet reworks on a favorite idea of his, the idea that the death is not as significant as it appears to be. The death of the poet may be significant to his admirers. The death of the poet may inspire the present poet to write the present poem, but it is not so significant as it appears to be to the world in general. I would like to pause here for a moment and bring into conjunction with this part of the poem W.H. Auden's extremely famous work, Stop All the Clocks, or Funeral Blues. It would be very meaningful, very profitable to work out a comparison and also a contrast between these lines of In Memory of W.B. Yeats and Stop All the Clocks, better known as Funeral Blues. The lines that follow continue the ideas contained in the preceding lines. The poet speaks of the importance and noise of tomorrow. Today is very important, but only today. By the time it is tomorrow, today would have become yesterday, and so significantly less important. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, the poet makes it clear that the world lives in the present and the past is significantly less important than the present. Always the present moment is the most important moment. When the brokers are roaring like bees in the floor of the bourse is the stock market, the French equivalent of Wall Street. The brokers are yelling their bids on the floor of the stock market and using this very powerful, very original simile, like bees. The poet makes his contempt for the stock market clear. The bourse is the French equivalent of what is Wall Street in the United States and what is the city in the UK, in London. The poet makes his contempt for the stock market clear. And you must remember that the stock market is the backbone of the capitalist economic system. And then the poet speaks of the poor and their sufferings, how they are rather accustomed to their sufferings. They think it is natural. They don't question it. They don't take part in a revolution, except in extreme situations. Again, the leftist leanings, the leftist sympathies of the poet become visible in these lines. And each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. We think that we are free. Each person thinks that we are free. But how far are we free? How far are our actions the result of the application of free will? It's a highly debatable question. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau declared, "Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains." Unquote. Each person is imprisoned in his own cell, in the cell of himself. But he thinks that he is more or less free, when in fact, practically every action of his is largely conditioned. I feel that here the poet echoes the famous statement of Rousseau that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. The two lines that follow repeat an idea which is again a stock idea of Auden. The poet says that a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. The insignificance of poetry. How poetry is unimportant in real life. A few thousand, the readership of Yeats, the admirers of Yeats, will number only a few thousand. Poetry has no mass following, unlike, say, cinema, unlike film. So, the day on which the greatest English language poet, arguably the greatest English language poet of the times, the day on which the greatest Irish poet ever breathed his last, will be remembered only by a few thousand. The very limited impact that poetry makes on the real world. And even they will think of the day as a day on which they did something slightly unusual. The section concludes with a touch of anaphora. The two lines which occur at the end of the first stanza are now repeated. And the poet tells us that what instruments we have agree that the day of his death was a dark, cold day. The use of anaphora gives the section a cohesiveness. The entire section is wrapped in the fact that physically, climatically, the day on which the great poet breathed his last was an exceptionally dark day, exceptionally cold day, even in the south of France. When we praise Auden for being a great poet, we frequently forget that Auden was a great prose writer as well. In the opening section of the poem under discussion, in the opening section of In Memory of W.B. Yeats, we meet with Auden the great poet and also Auden the great prose writer. The lines of the section have the force, the passion, the intensity, the flow of poetry. But they also display the logic, the schematics, the organization, of prose. Thus, the skills of Auden, the prose writer, and I mean this in a very positive sense, the skills of Auden as a prose writer are strongly visible in the first section of the poem under consideration, which is also a fine specimen of English poetry. We move to the second section, and there is a striking change of tone. We meet with a striking change of tone, and it has to be observed that the second section is not organized in stanzas, unlike the first section. The second section is one rather long stanza. The poet says, "You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all." You were silly like us. Typical Audenism, if I may call it so. Every human being is silly. When you try to take a look at that person from close quarters, a close-up shot always reveals that the person, that the subject is silly. The poet does not want to idealize and idolize his subject. Auden does not want to idealize and idolize Yeats. He does not want to put Yeats on a pedestal. He frankly, freely comments that Yeats was a silly guy. The poet does not merely say that his subject was silly. You were silly like us. A kinship is established between speaker and subject. All of us are silly. Auden is of course silly, and Yeats himself was silly. Your gift survived it all. What is important is that you made a great contribution to literature. Your gift survived it. Your literary genius survived it all, despite all the limitations, despite all the problems. Your gift survived it all, and you made a very significant contribution to literature. That is what matters. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Auden now tries to explain what he means when he says that the literary gifts of Yeats survived everything. That the literary genius of Yeats survived it all. What does he mean by it all? And equally important is, why does Auden say, you were silly like us? So what does he mean by it all? The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Parish is a unit in the Catholic Church, a unit of the diocese. Every parish is under a parish priest. A parish can be, in England, a territorial unit. In some American states, like Louisiana, it is a territorial unit. It's an administrative unit. The parish of rich women. Why does he use this word parish here? Very original of Auden to do so. A lesser poet would certainly not have done this. W.B.Yeats had a well-known weakness for women, especially rich women. It would require an independent lecture lasting several hours to cover all the women in the life of W.B. Yeats. Among the most outstanding figures, female figures in the life of W.B. Yeats are, of course, Morgan, Lady Gregory, Lady Wellesley, and I understand that when Yeats died, during the last few days of Yeats, during the last few days of the life of Yeats in the south of France, he was surrounded by women. He died surrounded by women, which I think is a marvelous way of dying. And my understanding is that his wife had no serious objection to his conducting romances with younger women in the very last phase of his life. Even though he was a very old man, he enjoyed conducting romances with younger women, much younger than himself. And I think he found it very inspiring. It was a sort of source of inspiration to him. The romances inspired him to write great poetry. How wonderful. Anyway, the parish of rich women. Parish is the poet trying to suggest that there was something holy, something sacred in the relationship of Yeats with his women friends, with his mistresses? Or is he trying to suggest that that was the religion of Yeats? Getting friendly with women, conducting romances with women, enjoying the company of women, enjoying the bodies of women, that was the religion of Yeats, the parish of rich women. And I understand that especially during the first part of his life, when Yeats lived a poverty-stricken life, he freely borrowed from his rich women friends. And of course, he forgot to repay his debts. Probably the women friends never expected him to repay the amounts that he borrowed from them. And he borrowed repeatedly in a rather systematic manner from Lady Gregory, but repaid everything after he got the Nobel Prize. The parish of rich women. Physical decay. In the later years of his life, Yeats had many health issues. His body suffered a degeneration, a systematic degeneration. But that did not affect his performance as a poet. Yourself. Auden's point is that despite all these things, Yeats wrote great poetry. Despite the fact that he lived in the parish of rich women, despite the fact that he suffered systematic physical degeneration, despite the fact that he was himself certainly not, according to Auden, the material poets are made of. Despite all these things, Yeats managed to make an extraordinary contribution to literature. I would argue that W.H.Auden is not exactly right when he claims that Yeats became a great poet. Despite these things, I would say that it was because of these things that Yeats became a great poet. The parish of rich women supported the literary career of Yeats financially, logistically, and emotionally. And the innumerable romances that he conducted throughout his long life, rather long life, inspired him to write great love poetry. Even physical decay was, strange to say, a source of inspiration for him, because Yeats has written quite a few poems on old age, on the weakening of the body, on the difficulties of living a life in an old and disintegrated body. Yourself, the character of Yeats, the personality of Yeats, the nature of Yeats certainly was extremely suitable for the creation of great poetry. My point is that it is not despite these things, but because of these things, that Yeats became a great poet. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Mad Ireland hurt you. You were pained by what happened in Ireland. And Ireland, you must remember, has a long tradition spanning centuries of political violence. What happened in Ireland was beyond the comprehension of many of the people outside Ireland. There was so much strife, there was so much struggle, there was so much violence, so much bloodshed spanning centuries. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry, hurt you and compelled you to write poetry. You must remember that W.B. Yeats had a rather ambivalent attitude towards the Irish national movement. Of course, he wanted Ireland to be free. Of course, he wanted the British colonial yoke to be thrown off. At the same time, he had absolutely no sympathy for the violent tactics followed by many of the groups fighting for Ireland's freedom. Mad Ireland hurt you and compelled you to write poetry, and some of Yeats's finest poems are written on Ireland. And the events that were part of the struggle, Irish struggle for freedom. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. There is no doubt that W.B. Yeats is a great poet, that he wrote extraordinary poetry, that he won the Nobel Prize, that he attained immortality. But his poetry was unable to change anything in the real world. Ireland continues to have her madness and her weather. Ireland was a mad country, at least from Auden's perspective. When Yeats started writing poetry, it continues to be a mad country. The weather of Ireland is notorious for being always moist, always damp, always rainy. The notorious madness and the notorious weather of Ireland remain unchanged despite the great efforts, the heroic efforts of W.B. Yeats. Now we come to one of the most famous lines penned by W.H.Auden. For poetry makes nothing happen. For poetry makes nothing happen. Poetry is unable to change anything in the real world. Poetry is powerful. Poetry is intense. Poetry is immortal. But its impact on the real world is zero. It is unable to change anything in the real world, for poetry makes nothing happen. This is an idea very dear to W.H. Auden, that poetry, even the greatest poetry, is unable to change the course of history. In an interview, Auden once remarked that all his poetry could not save the life of even one Jew murdered in the Holocaust. Poetry makes nothing happen. I don't think that we should interpret this as a cry of despair, but as a statement or fact. Poetry is powerless to modify reality. But why should one expect poetry to do so? Auden, of course, knows that poetry cannot bring about changes in the real world. The line, poetry makes nothing happen, has to be interpreted not as a cry of despair, but as a statement regarding the nature of poetry. And this interpretation is strengthened by the lines that follow. The famous line, poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making. Poetry exists in its own world, in its own universe. Poetry operates on a plane which refuses to intersect with the plane on which the real world operates, where executives would never want to tamper. Executives would never like to enter this world, the world of poetry, would never like to enter this universe, the universe of poetry. The universe of poetry is very different from the universe of business. Not only very different, it is very distant from the universe of business. Executives would never like to enter this universe. Literature is not economically viable. The writing of poetry is not a money-making scheme. A ranch is a livestock farm. Ranches of isolation. The writing of poetry is typically a very lonely process. Poets generally write poetry in solitude. Poetry is never or almost never born out of group discussion. Poetry is born out of intense emotion. Poetry is born out of strong passion. And these emotions, these passions may be beyond the comprehension of ordinary people, of people inhabiting the real world. The poet seems to believe that poetry has an existence all of its own. Poetry cannot change history. Poetry cannot change reality. But poetry is in a way history, is in a way reality. Poetry has an existence all of its own, and it is supported by ideologies which the poet believes in and which the poet is ready to die for. Poetry and its emotional and intellectual underpinnings may seem absurd to people living in the real world. But as I said, this is another world, the world of poetry. Poetry is a world by itself. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. Please take a good look at the last lines of the apostrophe addressed by the poet to W.B. Yeats, by the living poet to the dead poet, by the great poet to the greater poet. It survives, poetry survives as a way of happening. Just as life is a way of happening, poetry is a way of happening. Two very different things. Though poetry has no impact on the real world, it is a world by itself. It is a mouth. It is a voice. It is an expression. It is a way of putting things across. It is a very intense, a very forceful, a very immortal way of articulation, a mouth. The second section of the poem under discussion, the apostrophe, is remarkable for the extraordinary balance that it attains. The balance between the personal and the impersonal. The balance between the alleged weaknesses of Yeats the man and how Yeats overrode those weaknesses, overcame those weaknesses to create great poetry. The balance between the poetry of Yeats and poetry in general. We now move to the third section. The last section is crafted like a coffin. It begins by speaking of the burial of W.B. Yeats, or more exactly, the body of W.B. Yeats, and this is seldom noticed, and is shaped like a coffin. Now we meet with another apostrophe. This time it is not W.B. Yeats who is apostrophized, but the earth. Earth, receive an honored guest. The speaker apostrophizes the earth and requests the earth to receive an honored guest. The greatest Irish poet of all time, and one of the greatest English language poets ever, one of the greatest and arguably the greatest English language poet of the first half of the 20th century. W.B. Yeats is indeed an honored guest. It must be a proud moment for the earth to open its bosom and accept the mortal remains of William Butler Yeats. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. Vessel can here mean container, bowl, a hollow container. It is as if Yeats was a bowl of poetry, a container of poetry. You must remember that Yeats did practically nothing in his life except write poetry. He lived a life of total dedication to the muse, and presenting W.B. Yeats as a container of poetry, as a bowl of poetry, is a very accurate description of the life and achievement of W.B. Yeats. Now that poet is dead. All we have is his body, is his mortal remains. And the body cannot write poetry. The mortal remains emptied of the liquid of poetry. It is as if poetry is a liquid. This highlights the fluidity, the movement, the naturalness of poetry. Vessel can also mean ship or a large boat. It is as if W.B. Yeats was a ship carrying poetry, a treasure ship carrying the treasure of his poetry, navigating through the sea of life. Now that ship has its treasure removed. It is emptied of its poetry. The ship no longer carries the treasure it had carried, the treasure of poetry. Yeats died on January the 28th, 1939. The Second World War began on September the 1st, 1939. The second stanza, very accurately, very precisely, adumbrates the political atmosphere, not just the political atmosphere, but also the social atmosphere in Europe in the months preceding the outbreak of the Second World War. It is dark. It is not merely dark. It is the nightmare of the dark, and the dogs of Europe bark. One is reminded of the phrase, the dogs of war in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Dogs were used in war in ancient times, and the poet is referring to the dogs of war barking and very eager to begin the fight. The nations are all sequestered. The nations are all isolated in their hate. The atmosphere, the political and social atmosphere of Europe is certainly a frightening nightmare. Thus, the poet very effectively describes the context in which AIDS, or rather the mortal remains of AIDS, are the body of AIDS is buried in the south of France. The nations are preparing for war, and they are sequestered in their hate. They are isolated from one another. The poet makes it clear that there is no meaningful interaction among the nations of Europe. They are sequestered, they are isolated in their hate. It is clear that a great war is about to begin. What is going to happen, or rather what is already happening, is shameful. And one can see intellectual disgrace writ large on the faces of the peoples of Europe. It is not that there are no positive emotions. Pity is very much part of the human psyche. But right now, the seas of pity, it is true that there is pity in Europe. There are positive emotions in Europe. But right now, the seas of pity are locked, are frozen in each eye. Those who have pity are unable to express that pity, are unable to act inspired by that pity. The pity refuses to flow. The pity is frozen, very much in tune with the climatic condition of Europe at present. One of the coldest winters of the 20th century it was. And in tune with that, in sync with that, the seas of pity are frozen and cannot flow. Intellectual disgrace reminds one of the phrase intellectual hatred. W.B.Yeats uses the phrase in his famous poem, A Prayer for My Daughter. An intellectual hatred is the worst, so let her think. Opinions are accursed. Follow poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. The speaker now seeks inspiration from the dead poet. It is true that the situation is very bad, that the atmosphere is frightening, that we have entered a nightmare, that what is happening all around us is shameful, disgraceful. But W.B.Yeats is such a great poet that he can, even in this context, even in this situation, even in this atmosphere, give us, provide us with inspiration. And it is this inspiration that the speaker seeks from the dead poet. W.B. Yeats had an unconstraining voice. He spoke without any constraints, and he can very well teach us to rejoice, even when the appropriate decision might be to mourn. The great poet who is now dead, W.B. Yeats, will inspire us, will inspire the poets of today to farm a verse and make a vineyard of the curse. We are in extremely desperate times, in desperate situations, but the inspiration provided by the dead poet will help us to convert the curse into a vineyard. A vineyard is, of course, a grape plantation. It is one of the most productive things, one of the most beautiful things, one of the most soothing things in Western civilization, Western culture. Vineyards are repeatedly mentioned in the Old Testament and also the New Testament. The point is that the inspiration provided by Yeats is so powerful that the poets of today can use it to create great poetry, even under these extremely desperate situations, under these or in these extremely desperate times. Inspired by Yeats, the poets of today will sing of failure, of defeat, in a rapture of distress. Distress is extreme sorrow, pain. Rapture is intense joy, intense pleasure. The inspiration of W.B. Yeats, the inspiration provided by W.B. Yeats, is so magical, so divine, that the poets of today will create great poetry out of the material they find. They will sing of failure, they will sing of unsuccess in a mood of intense joy, in a mood of intense pleasure, which actually is a conversion of the feelings of intense pain, intense sorrow. The poetry will unleash a fountain in the deserts of the heart and teach the free man how to praise, though in fact he is imprisoned in the prison of each day. What is most needed in a desert is water, and this water is provided by the healing fountain of poetry. Similarly, what is most needed by a man imprisoned is freedom. And this freedom is provided to every man who is imprisoned in the prison of each day by poetry. And this poetry is inspired by the great poet who is now dead, William Butler Yeats. I would like to observe at this point that there is a significant contradiction in the thematic trajectory of the poem under discussion. In the second section, the poet says, poetry makes nothing happen. For poetry makes nothing happen. Now, the poet makes it clear that he believes that poetry can make certain things happen. Let us move to the stylistic aspects of the poem. Let us try to take a close look at them. We shall, as usual, begin with the title of the poem. We have already discussed the title in some detail. The title is a very simple, direct one. It gives the reader an idea of what to expect in the poem. It's a very appropriate title. The poem is organized in three sections. The first section is subdivided into stanzas. The second section consists of just one stanza. The third section is again subdivided into stanzas. The first section is divided into 6 stanzas. The second section is just one stanza. The third section consists of 6 stanzas, like the first section. Only the last section of the poem has an effective rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme is AA, BB, CC, DD. Auden's use of meter in the poem under consideration is rather unconventional. It is very difficult to scan section 1, and I think we can say that section 1 strongly resists scansion. Section 2 makes use of hexameter, but it is unrhymed. So section 2 is an unrhymed hexameter. Section 3, as I have already pointed out, is rhymed, and the rhyme scheme is AA, BB, CC. The meter is tetrameter, and I think we can say that it is trochaic tetrameter. Thus, the metrical organization of the poem is original and unconventional. In the second section, the poet makes brilliant use of para rhyme, all still, decay poetry. Again, this is something original and unconventional. The imagery of the poem is noteworthy and striking. We have urban images and rural images. We have images from nature and also images from the world of science. We have images from politics and images from international affairs. The poem under discussion or more accurately, the opening section of the poem under discussion contains one of the most brilliant similes in all Auden. When the brocas are roaring like bees on the floor of the boughs, when the brocas are roaring like bees on the floor of the boughs, the simile captures with remarkable effect the greed, the avarice, the lack of humanity of the brokers. And who can be a better symbol of Western capitalism than the brokers? The bourse or the stock market or the French equivalent of Wall Street is a very apt metaphor, or perhaps a very apt synecdoche for the capitalist system. I'm reminded of a sentence in the novel Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less by Jeffrey Archer. Perhaps Archer was influenced, was inspired by, was influenced by the poem under discussion by Auden to pen the sentence. Let me try to remember it. Henrik soon discovered that the whole world was a jungle. Sometimes the lions and tigers wore suits. Let me repeat it. Henrik soon discovered that the whole world was a jungle. Sometimes the lions and the tigers wore suits. Personally, I believe that the simile, which works out a comparison between the brokers in the stock market and the bees, is one of the most powerful, one of the most brilliant similes in all Auden. Usually we speak of the lion roaring, but here the brokers are roaring. The poet suggests that they are not human beings. They may look like human beings, they may look sophisticated, they may look cultivated, they may wear natty suits, but they are in fact beasts, animals, preying on their victims. And they are excellent representatives of Western capitalism. The poem also contains, again, it is in the first section, the poem also contains one of the most brilliant metaphors in all Auden. The dying AIDS, or rather, the dying body of AIDS is in this metaphor brought into comparison with a country in the throes of revolution. The provinces revolt. The city's squares become empty. Silence invades the suburbs. The current fails. Only an accomplished craftsman like W.H.Auden could have crafted such a brilliant metaphor. In Memory of W.B.Yeats, is a richly allusive text. There are allusions to the European winter, allusions to the World War which was brewing, allusions to the stock market which plays a pivotal role in the capitalist economic system, allusions to the personal life of W.B. Yeats, allusions to the character of W.B. Yeats, including his weaknesses, among other things. The poet repeatedly makes use of alliteration, the repetition of consonantal sounds at close intervals, in order to generate special effects. Examples are: he disappeared in the dead of winter, and the mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. The poet makes brilliant use of anaphora or repetition. For example, the last two lines of the first stanza of the first section: what instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day, is repeated at the end of the section. This is not merely anaphora. The anaphora converts the lines into a sort of refrain. What instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Enjambment is the overflow of sense and the overflow of sound across the boundaries of the line or the boundaries of the stanza. Auden makes use of enjambment several times in the present poem. For example, by moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. The line comes to an end at by moaning tongues. But the sense does not come to an end, nor does the sound. The sound, the sense and the sound overflow the boundaries of the line into the next line. By moaning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. An even more brilliant example of enjambment is provided by the words of the dead man are modified in the guts of the living. The words of the dead man, the line comes to an end there, but the sound and the sense overflow the boundaries of the line. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Caesura is in some ways the opposite of enjambment. Caesura is a pause in the middle of a line or near the middle of a line. Auden makes effective use of caesura in the poem under consideration. For example, the opening line of the second section. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. I repeat, you were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. There is no doubt that In Memory of W.B. Yeats is a great elegy, a great poem. It avoids sentimentality. It avoids mawkish emotionalism. It avoids exaggeration. Instead, it aims at clinical precision. Sometimes students point out that there are quite a few contradictions in the text of the poem. I agree with them. But you must try to take a holistic view of the poem as a whole, a holistic perspective of the text as a unit. I think that there is the presence of Auden the philosopher, Auden the scholar, Auden the essayist, and the poem. The poem is something of a dialectic. It is unfair to isolate passages from the text of the poem and say that this is what the poet means. Of course, this is what the poet means. But there are other things as well which the poet means. And it is the responsibility of the reader to see all these observations as part of the fabric of the poem. As I said, there is no emotionalism, there is no sentimentality, but there is grief. The grief is sincere, the grief is restrained, the grief is dignified. It is certainly a great elegy. And as in the case of any great elegy, the poet uses the opportunity of commemorating the memory of a senior poet to speak about so many things which at first glance may appear to be rather unrelated to the death of the poet, which is the subject of the poem. It is fitting that two lines from the poem under consideration, two lines from In Memory of W.B. Yeats, are inscribed on the memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, unveiled in honor of W.H.Auden. The lines are, I quote, "In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise," unquote.